Hey everybody, MichaelBtheGameGenie here, and today we're going to talk about games better on the Super Nintendo than on the Sega Genesis.
Goodbye.
So everybody, a couple months back I made a video on games that were better on the Sega Genesis than on the Super Nintendo, and I figured it was time that we actually reverse that, and today we're going to be making a video on games that are better on the Super Nintendo than on the Sega Genesis. This is something that I thought I would be very comfortable doing, but honestly, looking back on the games that I actually thought were better on the Super Nintendo than the Sega Genesis, they were actually a lot closer than I thought. And I'm going to put a disclaimer up here right now that all the games I'm going to mention today, you really can't go wrong either way. Both versions of the games are good. It's just the Super Nintendo version just stands out for the reasons that I'm going to talk about. Of course, in my last video, I started out with Mortal Kombat on the Sega Genesis, beating out Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo. So I figured there's no better place to start than this game. I figured the very best place to start on this video would be the sequel to the game that started the games better on the Genesis than the Super Nintendo video, Mortal Kombat 2. My only issue with starting with this game, and maybe making a comparison at all, is that I'm very biased to the Super Nintendo game, as it is how I spent the majority of my mid-teenage video gaming years. However, I can put on my objective hat here and show that the Super Nintendo game is better than the Genesis version, and not just on my bias. So we start with the Genesis version, and the first thing I will mention is that I find it extremely hard. I mean, Mortal Kombat 2 isn't an easy fighting game no matter how you slice it, but the PC shouldn't be able to so simply decimate me with straight punches upon a missed uppercut or missed special attack, but they do. I slip up for 1 second and boop, half my health bar is missing. I have to say that the Genesis is known for playing faster than the Super Nintendo, and this is an example of where that does not play in your favor on this one. I will say I'm not a huge fighting game fan, so maybe some people prefer the speed and difficulty, but it's a little too much for me. The controls are otherwise very similar to the last game, as it controls extremely well given though you are still limited by the 3-button controller, unless you have a 6-button controller. I will say that Mortal Kombat 2 really relies a lot heavier on the block button, just not for the regular combat, but also for pulling off fatalities and other finishing moves, and it is tricky maneuvering this while trying to hold the start button. Next is presentation, and here's where the Genesis really loses battle in my opinion. Let's face it, the graphics just aren't as good. This version does not look as crisp as the Super Nintendo version, but I will say they improved the graphics from the original Mortal Kombat on the Genesis. For one for me, and it's a huge sticking point, but the screen actually turns the correct shade of black during a fatality now. That means so much to me, you have no idea. But something looks off about the graphics, especially the backgrounds. Everything looks darker and almost checkered at points, like the Genesis is struggling to show the pre-rendered backgrounds for the fight. But maybe that's just me. I also have to say there is a weird sound to the music. It's just off and doesn't sound right. There are also some very big audio shortcuts, like them just showing fatality on the screen and not having the announcer say it. Hey, hitting one of these is a badge of honor, and I want my full celebration. Don't get me wrong, this is still a very good game, and plays extremely well despite my minor gripes, but this is the best home version of Mortal Kombat 2 in my opinion, and I don't just mean 16-bit either. I love Mortal Kombat 2 on the Super Nintendo, and I want to thank the team that put this together for not just fixing what was wrong with Mortal Kombat 1 on the system, but also going above and beyond and overcoming the Sega Genesis version. First of all, we need to get this out of the way. There was no restriction on blood and gore this time. That was the largest weapon in the Sega Genesis arsenal last time, was that they delivered the blood and gore from the arcades, while the Super Nintendo shied away from it. Not in this case, as Mortal Kombat 2 offers every single bloody move and fatality from the arcade in all its glory, and with an added bonus above the Genesis. When you hit the fatality, the announcer actually says fatality, and the blood drips down from the words. It really is the little things that make me happy. With that out of the way, let's talk about why else this game stands out above the Genesis version. One is gameplay, and this should be pretty understandable, but the standard Super Nintendo controller has more buttons than a Genesis controller, so therefore the layout is much better on the SNES for playing this game. Immediately you can differentiate between low punch and high punch, which is a massive plus. But most importantly for me with this game is the use of block. I rely so heavily on block to be able to pull off the majority of my finishing moves while locking my character in place, and the simplicity of just being able to hold a shoulder button instead of the awkward start to do so is a breath of fresh air. The second thing with the gameplay I really like is that I find the button combinations are equally responsive on both consoles, but the game plays just a little slower on the Super Nintendo, in this case, which is a good thing. Trust me, play it, and it's sometimes frustrating unfairness, and you will see it's a good thing. And I can usually get fairly far up the tournament ladder without coming across an unbeatable cheap character like Scorpion on the Genesis version. Last but not least, it's simply the presentation that pushes this version over the top. I don't even need to really go into much detail other than to say it looks and sounds better on the Super Nintendo. Like every game I'll be discussing today, you can't really go wrong with either version you choose, but in this case, if you want to play the better and certainly more aesthetically pleasing 16-bit version of Mortal Kombat 2, pick it up on the Super Nintendo. Let me start by saying, I love both versions of this game, and as a kid, it's the only game I rebought for a second system. The Sega Genesis version came out 3 months after the Super Nintendo version was released, and honestly, was a catalyst for me as a kid finally getting a Sega Genesis. Why would I buy it again, you ask? Well, the game changed up its characters, in fact, almost half the roster. While this is what ultimately led to me getting the game, it's also one of the reasons the Genesis version isn't as good as the Super Nintendo one. Even though the Genesis version of Royal Rumble came out after the Super Nintendo version, it seemed like it was behind the Super Nintendo version somehow. Let's start with what I have already briefly alluded to with the characters. Royal Rumble was released at an interesting time in WWF where they were shifting from the 80s era to the new generation, and even though the Genesis version was released after the Super Nintendo version, they relied heavily on the 80s era stars in the game. Young stars like Tatanka and Yokozuna were replaced puzzlingly by Hacksaw Jim Duggan and the model Rick Martel, who were on their way out of the company at the time. We did get one big win with the immortal Hulk Hogan being in the Genesis version, and I was pretty pumped to drop that atomic leg drop. We also got Papa Shango and IRS, along with the 7 characters that showed up in both games. In my opinion, that is a weaker roster, but I'll emphasize this better when I talk about the SNES game. The presentation also takes a hit. I'm not sure if this is a case of them just porting the Super Nintendo developed game onto different hardware or taking shortcuts while developing the Genesis version, but it just doesn't look as good, and it's totally unfair because the Genesis can do better than this. The graphics on the images and backgrounds for the character select screen and menus is where you really notice this. It is also noticeable during in-ring action, but much less so I wouldn't even call that an issue. The sound quality is good, but twangs at times, when it isn't necessary. The big difference is in the wrestlers' entrance themes, as you can notice a definite downgrade on sound quality for the superstars that appear in both games. Last but not least, we have to talk about the controls, because the Genesis has another failing feature here, where this game is made for a 6-button controller, like the SNES, but the Genesis has a 3-button standard. This leads to combination button pressing, which isn't terrible, but this game can get frustrating as you have to mash buttons in order to pull off a move, and sometimes when combining buttons, only one registers, and you do the wrong move. And when I say sometimes, I mostly mean all the time. This game, probably more than any other on the Genesis, requires you to go buy a 6-button controller. I know I did. I patiently, and I mean patiently, waited for this game to be released. As a kid, I actually wrote to Nintendo to complain there were no good wrestling games on the Super Nintendo, and talk about what I would like to see in a game. I actually got a letter back from them. For the kids out there, a letter is what we use before social media, that told me of a game coming that would answer many of my requests for a good wrestling game on the SNES, and that was how I first learned about WWF Royal Rumble. To me, Royal Rumble took the excellent concept from Super WrestleMania and added almost everything that was missing from the game that could be found in WrestleFest, the excellent WWF arcade game. Maybe I am a little biased because I thought it was perfect back then. Maybe because it had Mr. Perfect, who knows. Really looking back on it, the wrestling is pretty bland, as every wrestler uses the exact same moveset other than their finishing moves. But take yourself back to 1993 and remember all the shitty wrestling games we had up to this point. Yeah, this was perfect. The Super Nintendo version, although it was released prior to the Genesis version, still stands up as the best version. From a performance standpoint, it is better in almost every aspect, and I still believe this is simply because the game was designed as a Super Nintendo game, with the Genesis version as only an afterthought. I spoke about the graphics, and I mean you can compare for yourself, but they are sharper and brighter on the Super Nintendo. The sound is the true indicator, as some of the music on the Genesis just doesn't work, while the Super Nintendo versions sound so goddamn good, and just like the actual themes they were covering. This is what frustrates me, because the Genesis was capable of so much more, and the Super Nintendo shouldn't blow it away like this, but here we are. Next are the characters, and who are we kidding, the Super Nintendo had the better roster. Sure, we didn't have Hulk Hogan, but I'll trade Hulk Hogan any day for the woo nature boy Ric Flair. It's actually so weird to listen to his WWF theme here in this game. Also, Mr. Perfect and hitting the perfect plex is the absolute coolest shit in the world to me. You also had Tatanka and the $1 Million Man, but how did the Genesis version not include Yokozuna? I mean, he was a world champion at the time, and the top heel they were building around. Also, dropping a bonsai drop was what's up back then. Of course, we're going to talk about the controls, and simply put, this game was designed to work on the Super Nintendo. The controller not only had enough buttons to handle all the controls and functions of the game, but the button alignment fit perfectly with what moves the controller did. In fact, if you look closely, you will notice that as the buttons go up from the bottom to the shoulders, so does the required presses of hitting the moves. That's genius. Also, where you used to have to combine two buttons with the Genesis to hit a move was a negative there. Here, it's a positive. I would often double press X and R to more quickly increase the meter so I could hit a suplex earlier. It's like Bobby the Brain Heenan always said, win if you can, lose if you must, but always cheat. Again, no matter which version of the game you choose to play, you will have fun here, as they are both great, but the Super Nintendo far surpasses the Genesis in terms of quality, so play that one unless you absolutely need to drop an atomic leg. Sunset Riders is a weird one because this could almost be considered same game, different name, or almost a sequel because the two games are the same, but also very, very different. We start out with the Sega Genesis version, and I will say, off the bat, that in no way is this a bad game, and in fact has some aspects I prefer over the Super Nintendo game, but it's harder and maybe even a little unfair at times. The first thing I want to talk about is how different the versions are in terms of level design. I will be honest, I have never even played the arcade game, so I am only going on what I've been told, but the Super Nintendo version is closer to the arcade version. The Genesis version features longer levels split into two parts, where you rescue a woman in the initial part at the end, and finally face off against the boss in the second part. I mean, I guess it's personal choice, but both games are great, and I really like the differences between the two. And I guess a lot of people's choice on the level design comes down to, do you want an arcade port or a ground-up design game for the system using elements from the arcade? This is one area I don't really have a decision on, and leave that up to you to decide. One thing that does bother me though is that you can only select from two characters in the Genesis version, and they only feature half the bosses. I'm not sure why this was done, I guess to save space on the cart, but limiting the character choice and bosses was a really poor decision and took away from the game. The next is how the game plays and looks, and the Genesis version is weird. I say weird because usually the game speed is a plus for the Genesis, while everybody complains about how slow the SNES is, but here it's almost like the game moves too fast, and at times becomes impossible to avoid enemy gunfire. The game also chose to go with a more realistic style to the bullets, which is cool, but actually hard to see on the screen, and I find it sometimes gets lost in the background. The color scheme also seems darker on the Genesis, which is puzzling because one of the things that makes this game so special to me was a vibrant color pattern. The controls are interesting as they have two separate buttons for shooting, with one that holds your character in place while the other lets you run and gun. I honestly find this unnecessary, but yet there isn't a standalone button for sliding, which to me is a critical move in this game, especially with the sped up combat. The one thing I will say is I prefer that you can continue right where you died, and it's the only thing that allows me to get as far as in the Genesis version as I can in the Super Nintendo. I've always hated to restart a whole level in an arcade style game when I should just restart exactly where I died. You know, like in the arcade. The last and most criminal of all my gripes of the Genesis version is the voices are gone. I needs my, bury me with my money, said in inaudible English. This has always been my preferred version of the game, and I have already kind of alluded to why when discussing my slight gripes with the Genesis version. Like I mentioned before, I don't have a huge issue with the shorter or longer levels, but what I do have an issue with is missing levels and bosses. Thankfully, Konami on the Super Nintendo did their absolute best to include everything and recreate the arcade experience fully, meaning that while they are shorter, we get every level and every boss. Except this guy on the horse. Could have done without him and his difficult ass. Of course, it's not just the levels and bosses that are full, but we also get all 4 selectable characters, which of course is a huge plus to getting the Super Nintendo version. I mean, I could stop right there, buy the Super Nintendo version of Sunset Riders to get the full version of the game, and Star Wipe, and we're out. But there is more to it than that. Next up is the presentation, and again the Super Nintendo gives us what the Genesis version cut out in this awesome opening cinematic. I mean, we are already about to play a cool game, but the opening cinematic gets me fired up, and honestly just looks beautiful and sets the tone for the game perfectly. Next up is the color scheme, and I mean, look at it. It's just a brighter and more vibrant game on the Super Nintendo. I prefer this look, and I am sure I am not the only one. Next up is the bullets. Both from you and the enemies are very bright colors, and super easy to depict from the backgrounds, which is a huge plus for a guy like me with bad eyesight. The enemy bullets actually flash, making it super easy to keep track of them. While this may be a complaint for some, I believe it's a plus in this game, which is speed at which the bullets are coming at you from the enemies, and maybe the one time the Super Nintendo slowdown actually makes a game better. Maybe that's just a personal choice, but I do suggest this version would be more accessible to new and younger players to the game. That isn't the only area where I believe the gameplay is improved, as now it's easy to slide. I can't tell you how frustrating it is while playing this style of game and wanting to use a crucial and almost game-saving maneuver, only to have the controls prevent you from doing so. Luckily, the Super Nintendo controls allow you to slide at will, and believe me, you will need to if you want to make it to the end of the game. I still can't get very far in the game, and I'm going to need a lot more practice, but I have a lot of fun dying in it. Speaking of dying in the game, thankfully the voiceover audio clips are included, so bury me with my money. In all honesty, while I prefer the Super Nintendo version, I ask you to consider the Genesis version as its own game because I consider it to be a sequel more than just another version of the same game. Both games deserve your attention, but if you're only going to buy one, the Super Nintendo version offers the better experience. So everybody, that's just some games that I think are better on the Super Nintendo than on the Sega Genesis. I know this is going to be one of those topics that people get up in arms about because you have your camps. You have, still to this day, your camp that think that the Sega Genesis is the end-all, be-all system that ever came out, and the best 16-bit system. And then you have the other people that prefer the Super Nintendo, usually people that were really into RPGs in that system. Like, this battle has gone on for a long time, and people are still very strongly opinionated about it, calling the Super Nintendo the kiddie system, while the Genesis was the much more better and modern system. I don't know. I love both systems. I had both growing up, so I have very different opinions on it. A lot of games I prefer on the Super Nintendo, but there's some great Sega Genesis games too. So, you know, it's fun making a video like this where you get to pick apart the minute differences that between a game that came out on both systems and what makes it better. So anyways, what I want to know from you guys, what are some other games that you think had a better edition of the game on the Super Nintendo than they did on the Sega Genesis? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, thank you for sharing in my video game nostalgia. Hey there! Thank you for making it to the very end of the video. If you enjoyed the video, why don't you check out one of the other videos shown here? If you really enjoyed the video, you can even subscribe to my YouTube channel. And of course, if you really enjoyed the video, feel free to check out my Patreon. It would be appreciated.